Looking at the best way to do the art style for Trashman, the game I'm doing in month 11 of the challenge, penultimate month. Various ideas came to mind. One was to do it in full 3D, but based on a friend's suggestion, I've decided to explore the possibility of doing it in 2D with pre-rendered assets. So here we are in Blender with a very simple representation of one of the houses from the original game. I'm going to try and stick to the design as much as possible, so matching the house layouts and style, but just making them look a little bit more modern. I've done some initial work on just some simple texturing using some free brick and tile textures. Obviously needs a lot more work, but it's a starting point, and this is more to prove the technique than anything. So I render this in multiple passes out for use in Godot. You can see I've got multiple things here. I'm using Eevee as the renderer because it gives me a little bit more control. And I've got a custom shader set up to create a shadow catcher for the baseline. It allows me to do things like switch on an alternative house. I can make the roof into what's called a holdout, so that it basically punches a hole through the image. Hide the windows because we don't need them for this particular part, and the doors. If I can find the door, there's the door. And then make the flat roof also a holdout. And then if I go to the camera view, which I've set up as an isometric camera, you can see we get this render which is just the shadows and the shadows of the side of the house, which is really important. So that's this additional shadow, this additional version of the house I've created there, so that I've got the shadow of the house. So that's one render that I'd output, and then I can switch everything back on again. Switch, except for the path, switch the normal house back on and the special shadow house off, and then switch the roofs back to non holdout mode, and turn the floor, which is that, off, and then I'd render that as the main house. So again, that's what it would look like. And then the final render is with everything else switched off, and the roof, the windows, the door, and a separate object, the path, switched on. And the reason for having that as a separate render is so that I can control ordering, which you'll see in Godot in a minute. So those are the three renders that I came up with. I tried various other ways of doing it in Godot with light 2Ds and lots of different layers and splitting things up, but this seemed to be the simplest way, resulting in the fewest number of renders and images required in Godot. So switching back over to Godot very quickly, I'll show you an example of that house being brought in. So you can see we've got the three layers. They're in what's called a Y sort node, which just automatically sorts the children, and it can be nested, so you can have another Y sort in here, and it sorts everything within there based on their Y position, the Y position of their origin, which is really handy for things like isometric games. And I'll show you that in the game view in a second. But basically at the lowest level you've got the shadow that I exported. As I say, this is just for casting a shadow over the player when they're in the region. We've got the path, which is set to be always, I'll show you the organisation in a minute in terms of the Y sort, always below the player whenever the player is in range. And then you've got the house itself, and that's the three layers that combine together to create the final effect. So the important thing to look at when you look at each one is where this origin is. This is how they're sorted, so you can see they change as we go up. So this one basically means that the player will be in front of the shadow anytime it's below down here, but anytime it's above, it will be that the shadow will be rendered on top. So that means as the player moves above and into this region of the shadow, it will be darkened by the shadow, as you'd expect. The path, I've set the origin to be, or the Y position to be at the top edge or thereabouts, so that the player will always be on top of, it will always be rendered on top of the path until it goes above the path, and then it will be rendered behind, but it won't matter because there's nothing to see. And then the house, it really doesn't matter as long as the collision volumes or the collision shapes prevent you ever entering this part of the house. You'll see in a minute that it all works. So then I brought these into a mock-up of the game with a simple character. Not sure whether I'm going to use that character graphic yet. I don't quite like it, but we'll see. But you can see if I move this around, as we move into the shadows, it gets darker, and then out of the shadows it gets lighter. The rendering of that side of the house as part of the shadow map allows me to ensure that even though this is the shadow that's cast, this is in shadow and therefore casts a shadow on the player, so it looks more consistent. You can see that the player quite happily draws on top of the house as expected. If I go inside it's no good, but I'll have collision volumes to prevent that happening. You got the side partly in shadow, still on top of the path. As soon as you go above the path will be rendered on top, but you never see that. And then you can walk behind the house on the path and everything's fine. Again, collision volumes will prevent things like that happening, where you see the house drawn on top of the player when it shouldn't be. I'll just make sure you can't get that close. And you can do, I've got multiple ones here. Obviously in the final version there'll be lots of different houses and they won't be lit like this. This is just a simple mirroring of the one house that I've got, just to test how it all works together, but each side of the road will be rendered separately. So that seems to work. I'm quite happy with that, and I can render out multiple different designs of house quite easily in Blender with minimum effort, and hopefully get the game moving fairly quickly.